embassy statement 2 days ago, I think they are totally in meltdown over at State Department.
I'll say, Charles, that the administration and its supporters
just prevent these kinds of reprehensible videos from ever seeing the light of day. We do not stop individual citizens from expressing their views, no matter how distasteful they may be. There are, of course, different views around the world about the outer limits of free speech and free expression. But there should be no debate about the simple proposition that violence in response to speech is not acceptable.
Secretary Clinton talking today as you continue to look live outside the embassy in Cairo, Egypt, as the protests there continue. She's talking about this anti-Islam video. She went on to condemn the violence, and it was a very lengthy statement that she read. It comes on a day after the president was asked the question whether Egypt is an ally.
Would you consider the current Egyptian regime an ally of the United States?
I don't think that we would consider them an ally, but we don't consider them an enemy.
The word ally generally is used with a treaty ally, which is a different matter than the fact that we have a very close and long-standing partnership with the government of Egypt.
So is Egypt an ally, or is it not an ally?
I'm going to refer you to the White House for further parsing on this.
So forget about the president's words. You're saying that the administration, the State Department, still regards Egypt as a major non-NATO ally, and it is still a recipient of all the privileges that entails.
Yes.
Made for an awkward State Department briefing, and then the White House press secretary had this to say: the president, in diplomatic and legal terms, was speaking correctly that we do not have an alliance treaty with Egypt. Ally is a legal term of art. What about all of this in the broader context? Let's bring in our panel. Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst; Casey Hunt, national political reporter for the Associated Press and syndicated columnist; Charles Krauthammer. Well, Judge, a legal term of art.
News to me, Brad, as we talked about earlier today. The president misspoke. He clearly misspoke, and they're trying to walk back to it. And it is clear that Egypt is an ally. Since the Israeli-Egyptian War in 1967, we have given Egypt $70 billion. That's an ally, whether we have a treaty with them or not.
Question is how Egypt has reacted to this particular incident. Today, the President Morsi finally came out with a statement, Casey, but it took him a long time, and it happened after the President had a phone call, President Obama, with President Morsi late last night.
And that was a little bit different than what you've seen in Yemen today, where the Yemeni government came immediately out and made a statement. The one thing on Egypt, though, is as we've had this relationship with them for decades now, they've been under an authoritarian regime. And we're seeing some of this back and forth, in part because it's much different to deal with a country that's, just readjusting to the wake of the Arab Spring. Conditions on the ground are much different there than they have been in the past.
Charles, I want to go back to Secretary Clinton's statement at the beginning about this video, and a very long, detailed statement today.
It looks as if the administration has no idea what it thinks about what has just happened. We had that statement coming out of the embassy in Cairo, which was a disgraceful apology, and Romney attacks it, and then the White House hadn't said anything, but after the Romney attack, State Department denies it or disavows it, the White House does, and then of course everybody jumps on Romney because he criticized it. He was absolutely right in attacking it. And now, when we heard from Secretary of State Clinton, she basically repeated the apology. I oppose all this. We don't have any sympathy with. We deplore. I find it disgusting. Why are we? And then she has that line. I thought the worst line in the clip that you showed was this, where she said there are different views around the world about the outer limits of free speech. Why is she engaging in a disquisition on free speech with the mob? The implication here that perhaps the mob is right, that we ought to be suppressing anything that offends Islam. This is a nation that when somebody puts a crucifix in a bottle of urine, it ends up in a museum. We allow all kinds of expression. But perhaps we ought to make an exception in the case of Islam. This is absurd. She ought to be speaking to the heads of state, to the State Department equivalents in the other states, and you speak with your mob. You talk to them about this and you defend our embassies. I find this is a return to the sentiment of the embassy statement 2 days ago. I think they are totally in meltdown over at State Department.
I'll say, Charles, that the administration and its supporters said that they don't think it was an apology originally, number one. Number two, they point to Secretary Clinton's statement where she says the governments have to provide security for those embassies, and she went into detail about condemning the violence.
That's what she should have spoken about. That's what a Secretary of State does. You don't engage in a debate about free speech with a mob that wouldn't understand it even if it saw it.
Judge.
I agree with Charles, but Hillary Clinton is on the hot seat. She was in favor of bombing Libya. Whatever you think of Gaddafi, the ambassador would never have been killed if he was still there. And she was in favor of the mob that now has ascended to the presidency that pushed Hosni Mubarak out. She's trying to walk a very delicate line. She did so awkwardly and without credibility.
Casey, there's real concern about tomorrow. It's a day of prayer around the Middle East, obviously around the world for Muslims, and they're really concerned about these embassies. We saw Yemen. We're seeing live pictures right now outside Cairo. Security's heightened all over the world. What about this and the broader implications for the administration for this policy?
Like any foreign policy crisis, especially this close to a presidential election, what we're dealing with is something that's extremely unpredictable. And that's what some of the critics of the president were saying over the past couple of days. It's that while on the one hand, Romney took a lot of heat for making his statement as quickly as he did when the facts weren't all clear, there were some folks who are still saying, hey, look, we don't know how this is going to play out. The violence all across the region, it's very unpredictable. We don't know what might happen next. And it's very possible that the president could find himself in trouble depending on what happens.
I should point out, we've heard reports of Molotov cocktails there. We've seen explosions throughout the night, that just big puff of smoke. They've been using tear gas, the authorities there on the ground. Charles.
What we're seeing on that screen is the meltdown, the collapse of the Obama policy on the Muslim world. The irony is that it began in Cairo, in the same place, with a speech he made, beginning of his presidency, in which he said he wanted a new beginning with mutual respect, implying that under other presidents, particularly Bush, there was a lack of mutual respect, which was an insult to the United States, which had gone to war 6 times in the last 20 years on behalf of oppressed Muslims, in Kuwait, the Kosovo, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So to imply that we somehow had mistreated the Muslims, which was the premise of his speech, and how the Iraq War had inflamed the Arab world against us. Well, there was no storming of the U.S. Embassy in Cairo in those days. What we're seeing now is Al-Qaeda developing in Libya, a meltdown of our relations with Egypt. We've got riots in Yemen, attacks on our embassy in Tunisia. This entire premise that we want to be loved and respected, we're going to apologize, is now yielded all of these results, and these are the fruits of apology and retreat and lack of confidence in our own principles.
Next up, American diplomats under siege in the Middle East, and how is the media covering all of this?